Have you ever walked into a room and felt like your soul didn't belong there? Like everyone had something to show for their lives? A child, a job, a testimony, a blessing. And you were the one standing in the back, clutching empty hands no one could see. That was Anne. That was Joachim. And maybe that's you. They weren't rebels. They weren't sinners. They were faithful. But in a time when faith was measured by fertility and worth was whispered through wombs, they had nothing to show. No child, no future, no evidence that God was still watching. Jerusalem, 1st century before Christ, stone streets sunlit and loud. Children ran between carts, traders shouted blessings over figs and cloth. And in the middle of it all walked a man with tired eyes, and a woman who flinched when people smiled at their silence. Joachim and Anne were known. He, a descendant of King David, royalty etched in his bones. She, a daughter of Aaron, priesthood flowing in her blood. To the world, they were sacred. To their neighbors, suspicious. Because beneath their robes, beneath their heritage, beneath their prayers, there was absence, a silent void that never kicked, a cradle that never rocked, a dream that never cried in the night. And worse, they lived among those who believed emptiness was not just a condition, but a condemnation. God has closed her womb, they whispered. She must have done something wrong, said the women at the well. Even the temple priests stopped blessing their offering with both hands. And one year, as Joachim walked into the temple for the feast of dedication, his lamb wrapped in linen, his grain crushed by devotion, a priest stepped forward and raised his hand. "No," he said, "God does not accept offerings from the barren." Silence fell over the courtyard like a stone dropped in water. Joachim's face didn't move, but something inside him shattered. Have you ever heard words that didn't just wound your heart, but your very identity? Not because they were new, but because someone finally had the nerve to say aloud what you always feared might be true. He turned, not in rebellion, not in pride, but in the quiet agony of a man who could no longer carry a blessing that never came. Anne watched from the shadows. She saw the way his back curved forward, not from age, but from grief. She didn't run after him. She didn't know where he was going, only that when a man disappears into the desert, he doesn't come back the same. Joachim wandered past the hills of Judea, past the olive groves that mocked him with their fruit, until even the wind forgot his name. He reached the desert, not to escape, but to surrender. The dust bit into his sandals. The nights clawed at his skin. He slept on stones and ate only the silence between stars. 40 days, 40 nights. Not one word from heaven, and yet he stayed. Because sometimes you don't fast for an answer. You fast because it's the only language your soul has left. You kneel not because you believe, but because you're afraid of what you'll become if you don't. This was not the faith of fire. This was the faith of ashes, the kind of prayer that doesn't rise like incense, but crawls through the cracks in your chest, whispering, "Still, I trust you." Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Anne lit a candle. She placed it beside the window, the same one she once stood beside every morning, hand resting on a belly that never grew. Now she sat. She watched the light flicker, and she listened to the quiet of a house that never knew lullabies. The neighbors didn't knock anymore. There were no more herbs gifted for fertility. No more, "Have faith, Anne. Next year will be different," because it hadn't been different for decades. And so she prayed, not with words, but with weariness. Sometimes our greatest act of worship is just not walking away. She whispered the same names over and over: Ruth, Hannah, Sarah, women who had once been where she was, and somewhere in the shadows. A promise that had been waiting since Eden began to stir. What do you do when your prayers become dust? Not because they lack faith, but because you've said them too many times, cried them into too many pillows, watched them die quietly while the world moved on. Joachim didn't run to escape. He ran because he couldn't breathe anymore in a place where his name meant shame, where his silence filled more rooms than his words ever could. He walked for days, each step deeper into wilderness, a land so empty, even your thoughts echo back like strangers. There were no roads, only sharp stones, burning skies, and nights so cold the stars felt like glass in the wind. He didn't take water, he didn't take food. He took only his offering, not the lamb the priest rejected, but his soul, still bleeding from the words, "You are not worthy." Have you ever been told that your suffering disqualifies you from being used by God? That your pain makes you invisible? That your disappointment is proof that heaven has moved on? That's what Joachim heard. And yet, he stayed in the desert. Because sometimes it's better to kneel in the silence of God than to speak in the noise of men. On the seventh night, his knees gave out. He fell to the earth like a branch finally broken. Tears carved lines in his dust-covered cheeks. He didn't cry for a child anymore. He cried for something deeper, to be seen, to know he was still known. The desert didn't answer, but something else did. A wind, unlike any he had known. It didn't sting, it soothed. It wrapped around him like a cloak of breath, and out of the wind came light. But not the kind that burns, the kind that beckons. Joachim raised his head, and before him stood something no wilderness had ever offered, an angel, not with thunder, not with sword, but with stillness so heavy it bent the air. "Joachim," the angel said, "the Lord has heard your tears. No thunder, no fire, just a sentence that melted decades of silence. You will return to your wife, and she will conceive. The one who comes from her will carry the light of the world." Joachim trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of hope after so much hunger. He tried to speak, but his lips forgot how. The angel smiled, not with his face, but with something in the atmosphere, as if heaven was exhaling joy. And just like that, he was gone. No chariots, no dust, just absence. And for the first time in 40 days, Joachim stood with purpose. He walked back, past the bones of old trees, past the ghosts of unanswered prayers, past the stones he once cried on. He walked with feet blistered, but spirit burning. He didn't need to see proof. He had seen presence. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Anne was sleeping, and in her sleep she dreamed of gates made of gold, of rivers that whispered her name, of olive trees blooming in winter. She felt something stir, not in her belly, but in her soul. She awoke with tears she didn't understand, laughter she hadn't tasted in years. She looked out the window, and there, walking through the dust in the morning fog, was the man she thought she had lost, Joachim. They didn't speak, they ran. Old legs forgetting age, old wounds forgetting pain. And at the Golden Gate of Jerusalem, they met. He opened his arms, she fell into them. They kissed, not with passion, but with promise. The kind of kiss that happens when heaven brushes earth. Church fathers say that kiss was holy. Some even say it was the very moment Mary was conceived, not with human fire, but with divine wind. The womb that had been empty for decades shuddered with glory. The barrenness cracked like ancient stone, and the soil of their sorrow received a seed only God could plant. Do you feel barren today? Emotionally, creatively, spiritually? Maybe what's dying in your life isn't death. Maybe it's the silence before God whispers the miracle. Have you ever witnessed light, not with your eyes, but with your soul? A kind of light that doesn't shine on the skin, but warms the very places inside you that the world forgot. That's the kind of light that entered the world when Anne's body trembled, and the silence of her womb shattered. It happened on a Saturday. The streets of Jerusalem were quiet, the Sabbath hush covering the stones like breath. Anne lay in her chamber, a candle flickering at her side. Joachim knelt nearby, his hands shaking, not in fear, but in awe. Years of silence, now concentrated in a single moment of becoming. And then, a cry, not of pain, but of arrival. The room filled with fragrance, not of oils, but of something unexplainable. A scent that felt like dawn, a sound that felt like purpose. The midwife wept. Joachim stood. Anne held the child. And for a moment, the world paused. She was small, but her presence was vast. Her eyes were closed, but her very being seemed to see. Anne pressed her lips to the newborn's forehead and whispered a name, Miriam, Mary. In Hebrew, bitterness turned to light. In prophecy, the Lady of the Flame. In heaven, the gateway of salvation. They didn't know that the tiny breath echoing in the room was the same breath that would one day whisper, yes, and change history. They didn't know that the tiny hands reaching for her mother would one day cradle the Savior of the world. They didn't know that the girl whose cry pierced the air would one day stand silently beneath a cross. But heaven knew, and hell trembled. The days after her birth were filled with a stillness that wasn't empty. It was sacred. Joachim would rise early, just to hold her as the sun climbed the temple walls. Anne would sing to her, melodies handed down from priestesses, notes lost in time, now finding a home in her daughter's ears. Neighbors came to see. Some said nothing, others wept. Because when you behold a miracle, sometimes all you can do is stare. And yet, they knew. She wasn't just theirs, they had made a promise. If God gave them a child, they would return her to Him. So, at the age of 3, when most children are still learning to walk without falling, they dressed her in white. Joachim braided her hair with trembling fingers. Anne stitched prayers into her garments, and together they walked with her, up the steps of the temple. The city didn't notice, but heaven leaned in. As Mary stepped past the gates, rabbis paused mid-chant. The flame in the altar flickered, and some say even the veil swayed in stillness. She turned once, looked at her parents, and smiled. It wasn't a smile of separation. It was a smile of trust, as if she already knew, my life is not mine. And in the silence that followed, Anne wept, not out of loss, but out of fullness. Because sometimes the deepest love is the one that lets go. Mary lived in the temple for 9 years. She learned the scriptures. She watched the sacrifices. She listened to the stories of the prophets and knew deep down that one day the story would turn toward her. The other girls loved her but didn't understand her. She often gazed into nothing and smiled, as if something or someone was speaking where no voice could be heard. Have you ever looked at a child and known, without words, that they carried something ancient? Mary wasn't just pure, she was prepared. Every cell of her body had been sculpted by the breath of the divine. She didn't belong only to time, she belonged to eternity. And Joachim and Anne, they would visit her, bring her figs and nuts, leave scrolls and cloth. But each year, their visits grew shorter, their steps heavier, because watching a promise grow also means letting the dream outgrow you. One winter, Joachim fell ill. The man who once survived the desert now struggled to hold a cup. He looked at Anne and smiled. "She is the proof," he said. The silence was never a punishment, it was a preparation. He died with peace in his hands, and Anne, now alone, lit candles in his memory while whispering the same lullaby she once sang to Mary. Years later, Anne too closed her eyes. No crowds, no temple bells, just the quiet knowledge that she had done her part. She had carried the light before it had a name, and Mary, she would never forget. In every word she taught Jesus was the voice of Anne. In every silence she bore was the strength of Joachim. In her surrender was their shadow. What happens when your name doesn't make it into the great songs, when your sacrifice isn't carved into stone, and no one builds cathedrals in your honor? Are you still holy? Are you still essential to the plan of God? Joachim and Anne died quietly. No visions, no trumpets, no resurrection from tombs. Their bones rested in the land they once wept over. Their names, for a time, faded into silence, but their legacy was carved into the DNA of the girl who changed the world. Mary never forgot, even as the angel appeared to her, and she trembled with the weight of divine interruption. The memory of her parents steadied her. She didn't just say yes to God because she was brave. She said yes because her father once said yes when heaven was silent. Because her mother once believed even when her arms were empty. Mary's fiat was born in the shadows of their obedience. Have you ever lived in a house built by invisible hands? That was Jesus. The man who walked on water, who calmed the storm, who healed the blind, was carried in the womb of a woman who was once carried in the faith of two forgotten saints. The miracles of Jesus began in the tears of Anne. The crucified Christ was once the baby held by a girl whose name was whispered through decades of waiting. And behind that girl were two people who never got to see the cross, never got to witness the resurrection, never touched the hem of the miracle, but made it all possible. Do you understand now that perhaps the greatest callings in this life will never be posted, never be published, never be praised, but they will be planted, and seeds planted in secret often bear the fruit of salvation. Maybe you are living like Anne and Joachim right now. Maybe you've obeyed and still feel overlooked. Maybe you've served faithfully and see no harvest. Maybe you love people who don't say thank you. Maybe you pray every night for a child who has left the church. Maybe you cook and clean for a family that doesn't notice your effort. Maybe you cry alone in the bathroom while still smiling in front of everyone else. You're not invisible. You are essential. You're living the legacy of Anne. You're walking the faith of Joachim. In a world obsessed with platforms, posts, and performance, they lived quietly. In a culture that measures value by likes, numbers, visibility, they disappeared into the background. And still, they raised the Mother of God. That's what the kingdom of heaven looks like. Not always loud, not always praised, but always faithful. Their names echo not just in stained glass, but in every woman who says, "I'm tired, but I'll keep going." In every father who prays for his family in secret. In every widow who lights a candle for a child in the dark. in every grandparent who blesses meals when no one else believes. Their story is found in nursing homes, in apartments with peeling paint, in hospital beds, in the soft hands of those who pray while no one watches. Anne is not just Mary's mother. She is the matron of every woman who has dared to hope after menopause, of every woman who raised another woman stronger than herself. She is the whisper behind every mother's lullaby and the tears in every grandmother's rosary. Joachim is not just the father of the Virgin. He is the hidden builder, the old man who worked in the background while prophets claimed the spotlight. He is the dreamer in silence, the man who believed enough to beg, the father whose offering was rejected by men, but accepted by heaven. He is the one who reminds us, not all saints wear halos in life. Some wear dust, and grief, and prayer. And you? Where do you find yourself in this story? Maybe in their longing, maybe in their loss, maybe in their kiss. Wherever it is, you are not forgotten. Their feast is celebrated on July 26th, not just as names on the calendar, but as reminders that heaven sees what the world forgets. In the East, their devotion bloomed early, sung in chants of monks, etched in ancient icons. In the West, it took longer, but eventually, their relics were spread like sacred seeds across Europe, Asia, Africa, and hearts. Today, in cathedrals and chapels, in the candles lit in Durin, in the orações feitas por avós no interior do Brasil, in the terços escondidos em bolsas de mães anônimas, their legacy breathes. Their story is still told, but more importantly, their story is still lived. What if I told you that the greatest moment of your life might not happen in front of anyone, that the legacy heaven remembers is often written in invisible ink? Joachim and Anne never saw the angel that visited Mary. They never heard the Magnificat. They didn't hold Jesus in their arms. They weren't at the manger nor at the foot of the cross. Their names were not carved into the Gospels. And yet, every page of salvation history rests upon their faith. Because what God builds, He begins in silence, and what seems like delay might be design. There is something sacred about trusting God when He hasn't spoken yet. Something powerful about walking by faith when there's no miracle in sight. That was Anne's life. That was Joachim's love. That might be your story too. Are you waiting? Not for a baby. Maybe for healing, maybe for meaning, maybe for the pain to stop. You pray, but the sky seems empty. You hope, but the door stays closed. You fast, you light candles, you weep, and still, silence. But what if this silence is not abandonment, but preparation? What if you are not forgotten, but being carved? What if your barrenness is the soil for something eternal? Anne and Joachim teach us that delay is not denial, that shame is not truth, that what the world mocks, God might be exalting. They are the patron saints of the invisible, of every person who prays in the dark, of every soul who keeps sowing without seeing the harvest. Your story isn't small, even if no one's clapping, even if your name isn't trending. God sees the offering you bring, even if the temple rejects it, even if the priest says no, even if your own heart doubts, because the Father sees in secret, because the Son was born from silence, because the Spirit breathes through broken things. You are not forgotten. You are not unseen. You are not too late. You are in the hands of a God who planted salvation in a barren womb and watched it bloom through generations. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes, with the princes of his people. He settles the childless woman in her home as a happy mother of children. Praise the Lord. Psalm 113, 7-9. Joachim, the shamed man, was seated in heaven among kings. Anne, the woman of tears, was called Mother of the Mother. And you, what will God do with your silence? If this story whispered to your heart, if it mirrored a quiet pain no one else sees, if it lit a candle in your night, comment below, God remembers me. Subscribe to Heaven's Breath channel for more stories that speak where the world stays silent. Share this video with someone who feels barren, in spirit, in joy, in love. Tell them, the story is not over. The silence is not the end, and heaven never forgets.